right, welcome to Talks at New Haven. I'm your host, Josh Robinson, and joining me today, as always, is my co-host,
Alton Booth.
On today's episode, Alton and I are going to be discussing the topics of sacrifice and atonement, beginning in Genesis 3:21, and then we're going to kind of be tracing that all the way throughout the scriptures, and then we're going to start kind of looking at that from the perspective of the New Testament authors, particularly in the book of Hebrews, which speaks on this quite a bit. And so it should help us to understand really what's going on here in Genesis 3:21, and then also with the entire sacrificial system throughout the Old Testament.
Right.
So before we get started, Alton, how you feeling today, pal? How's it been today?
Not too bad. Went to church this morning and went to watch Disney on Ice after that, so that's always fun, taking a 2-year-old to a 2-hour show. She enjoyed about 15 minutes of it, and the rest just wanted to run around. You know how it goes.
Yep, absolutely. Had we taken Jane, that's what she would have probably have done too.
Yeah.
So. Well, that's good. I'm glad you guys enjoyed this Father's Day. If you guys are tuning in today, if you're fathers, happy Father's Day. We're glad that you're joining us today. And so we'll go ahead. I'll read Genesis 20 and 21. We'll mainly be focusing on verse 21. I'll go ahead and read the text for us. So the Lord says through Moses, "The man shall call his wife Eve, because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skin and clothed them." So we'll kind of take it. I'll hit briefly on verse 20, even though we said that we was going to mainly be focusing on verse 21. But the interesting thing here that the ESV Bible notes, if I'm not mistaken, I touched on this I think last year, that Adam and Eve, their names actually mean mankind and life.
Yeah.
The ESV Bible notes that that Eve sounds like the Hebrew for life giver and resembles the word for living, right? So that's what's going on in verse 20. You know, Adam names his wife Eve, or life giver, or living, and the reason why is because she is going to become the mother of all the living. All in this thinking, all people in the earth are descended from this couple. And so in verse 21. Now we have God clothing the man and the woman after he's made the curses of the fall, right?
Right.
And so one of the things that I noted in this morning's sermon, let me get my outline here. One of the things that I noted this morning that's interesting here, although I think is interesting, is that in verse 7 of chapter 3, the man and the woman had clothed themselves with leaves.
Right.
Right. And here, God removes the garments that they made of leaves, and now he clothes them in garments of skins. Now, you know, there's some debate out there on what exactly the garments of skin are. There's a lot of different thinking out there. I think that it's probably an animal that God has sacrificed, and the reason why is because we're going to see this theme of animal sacrifice runs throughout the rest of the Old Testament. So I think that God himself has most likely sacrificed an animal, and he's used its hides to cover the man and the woman. So, but to kind of get us started, I think that this, right here in Genesis 3:21, this is where the biblical themes of sacrifice and atonement begins. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is the first time that we really see sacrifice. So let's just look a little bit and kind of a broad overlook of what sacrifice is in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
We see it immediately following this up, actually, in Genesis 4. Yep. We see Cain and Abel making sacrifices. And then we see it kind of fleshed out a little more later on in Genesis, and we see the purpose of the sacrifices. So the sacrifices are made, especially once we get to the temple. The sacrifices are made once a year by the high priest.
Right.
He goes in and he takes in with him to the most holy place. He takes in the blood. And what taking in the blood and spilling the blood in the most holy place does is it forgives the sins of Israel for a year.
Right, and he's also using it to cleanse himself of his own sins before he goes in. So it's kind of this idea that we've touched on a little bit throughout the Genesis series so far, this idea of sacred space, right?
Yeah.
So he goes in, he's sprinkling blood on various places in the temple, on furniture. So he's making this space ritually pure. He's making himself ritually pure so that he can go and, be in the presence of God. And then he enters into the holy place once a year, where the presence of God comes down on the floor in the form of this glory cloud that hovers on the mercy seat of the Holy of Holies. And but yeah, it's signifying what you're talking about.
So the spilling of blood and the sacrifice is for the forgiveness of the sins of the nation of Israel. So that's why we can say here in verse 21 that this is the first, kind of the first example of that sacrificial system at work.
Yep.
So God didn't spill the blood of an animal needlessly.
Right.
He didn't spill the blood of an animal for game. He didn't spill the blood of the animal for no reason. He spilled it to quite literally cover up the sins of Adam and Eve.
Yeah. So you've just touched on the idea of purification, the priest purifying places in the temple, purifying himself. So that's one of the things that the sacrifice does here. And if we think about it, it does two other things here too. So we also have the idea here of substitution, right? Or we could just say substitutionary atonement as a whole. So what's going on here is, rather than the man and the woman dying for their sins, which they deserved,
and which was promised to them.
That's exactly right. God slaughters an animal as a substitute in their place. So it's for purification, it's for substitution, and then we've got atonement. So we actually see that at the end of verse 21. So the word atonement literally means covering. Right. If you go to Google right now and if you look up a definition in a Bible dictionary of what atonement means, it just simply means a covering. And so that's what's going on here in verse 21. So we see that God sheds the blood of the animal, right? And then he makes skins and clothes them, atones for them out of the skins of this animal. So that also goes on as well in the sacrificial system as well. It gets tweaked a little bit there. Right. So what happens there, though, I think I mentioned this in the sermon this morning. I can't remember. If it wasn't, it was in a conversation this week. But what happens there is the sacrifice is made. The blood is sprinkled on various places. It's put upon, the altar. It rises up to the nostrils of God, and then the priest would take it and he would bring some of it back. He would eat some of it, and it would be shared with the person who made the sacrifice. So it's actually a sharing of the covenant meal together. And what they would do is they would take the flesh of this sacrifice into themselves. So you see the idea of it's very similar to being clothed in the skins, but you're taking it into yourself. So, yep.
Yeah, and we also see it get tweaked a little bit as we go on. We'll get later on, and there's going to be sacrifices where there's going to be 2 goats are brought in for the sacrifice, for the yearly sacrifice. And this is where we get the term scapegoat. So you have the 2 goats, and the sins of the nation are placed on these 2 goats. The first is killed because there has to be the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sin. We'll touch on that a little bit later when we get over into Hebrews. The second one is sent out into the wilderness.
Yeah, it's carrying the sins away outside of the camp.
Right, they put the sins on the goat, and they send it from, back to our conversation on sacred space, they send it away from the sacred space inside Israel to the profane space outside of Israel.
Yeah, and I think it's Leviticus 18. Actually, some of our listeners will appreciate this. I think it's Leviticus 18. I'll have to look. That mentions that there's actually a spiritual being out there named Azazel, who is, which, if you've got the whole understanding of spiritual beings in your mind, this is a spiritual being who is in profane space, right? So, which helps us to see in an even clearer way that this is profane space. This is a place where demonic entities are dwelling. Sin is going where it needs to be, right? Where the demonic is at, and it's outside of the presence of the Lord God. It's Leviticus 17, it talks about the place of sacrifice, and it says, so they shall sacrifice no more, their sacrifices to goat demons. Anyway, I might have to go back another time and look at that. We'll have to talk about that another time. I don't think I got time to talk about it all today. But anyway, that's what's going on.
If you want to go ahead and look for that. Another thing we see is these sacrifices at the temple, these sacrifices at the tabernacle, even the sacrifices before that, they occur yearly.
Yep.
They're not to use New Testament language, they're not a once and for all sacrifice.
That's right.
Because the blood that's being shed is earthly blood. It is the blood of creation that is being shed for the forgiveness of the sins of creation.
Yeah.
Which works, but only for a certain period.
Right. Yeah. There's this constant need of having to repeat the ritual.
Right.
Right. You have to repeat it, and then not only does it have to be repeated, but it has to be done under certain guidelines or laws. Right. There are certain things, like you have to bring things that are without spot, without blemish, that type of thing. So it's not only do you have to repeat this ritual, but that it also has to be done under certain things. And so that's that plays a huge part. You're going to see a contrast whenever we get to Jesus in the New Testament, right? So.
Right. You're going to see the difference between the shedding of earthly blood for the forgiveness of sins and the shedding of God's own blood for the forgiveness of sins.
Yeah. Yeah. So give me just a second here. It's Leviticus. It's Leviticus 16:8. I found it. So this is on the Day of Atonement, which is the day you're talking about. That one time a year when the scapegoat gets sent out, and it says, "Aaron shall offer a bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself, and then for his house." So you've got this idea of purification, that kind of thing, sacred space. Then he shall take 2 of the goats, set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats. So there's some interesting things going on there. And then 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. So you have this. There's a note down here at the bottom. It says, the meaning of Azazel is uncertain, but it's most likely the name of a place or a demon, traditionally a goat demon. So you also see that in Leviticus 17, which I read a minute ago, where it specifically says in verse 7 that they will no more make sacrifices to goat demons, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of theology that we could tie into that, but for right now, that just goes to strengthen the point that this is profane space outside of the camp of Israel, not where the God of Israel is dwelling. So
right. So to kind of trace the pattern of sacrifice through the Old Testament, I talked about, as we were wrapping up last week, how they were able to meet God in a fallen world. So we see here in the garden sacrifices made.
Yep.
God makes the sacrifice in the garden. But we see when we get outside of the garden, we have Cain and Abel making sacrifice on an altar.
Yep.
Then as Israel grows, as the nation grows from a small extended family in Abraham up to becoming the sons of Abraham, which is starting to kind of get into being a bigger nation, we see them start to centralize a little. And then we see the tabernacle being built, which is your mobile tent.
Yep.
And inside that mobile tent, there is a mobile altar where sacrifice can be made.
Right.
After that, Israel inherits their own land. They come into their own land, and they're able to build a permanent temple. Yeah. So this is going to be right around 1000 BC, somewhere in that area. Israel's able to build their own temple. It's a permanent temple, and what's one of the things that's there in that temple? It is the altar. Yeah. And so what we can see from that, from the fact that there was always an altar, no matter if it was a family of, from what we're told, a family of 4, basically, with Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, all the way up to it being a an entire nation, there's the need for an altar.
Yep.
There is the need for sacrifices and repeated sacrifices.
Yep. So that's basically what's going on with this old covenant thing, right? So this is what sacrifices are for, right? It's for these things that we mentioned, which are substitution, purification, atonement. This is what's going on with the sacrifices, starting here in Genesis 3:21, going through Cain and Abel, also going to Noah in Genesis chapter 9, right after the floodwaters abate. One of the first things that Noah does is he makes a sacrifice. Then through Abraham to Israel, right? This is what's going on with the entirety of the sacrificial system, the temple complex, the tabernacle, all of that, right? There's purification happening, sacred space, atonement, covering, all of that, okay?
Yeah.
So that sets the backdrop for us for what's going on here in the New Testament, right? And so some of the things that I said to our congregation this morning is that in the sacrifice of Jesus, all of these sacrifices that was made for atonement, ultimately they point to his sacrifice, which is made for atonement. Right? And in contrast to all of the other sacrifices, his sacrifice is not one that is repeated over and over and over again, like on a yearly basis. His is a once-for-all sacrifice, and the writer of Hebrews actually talks about this specifically. So let's dive into Hebrews a little bit and talk about what's going on here in Hebrews. So.
All right, so we're going to dive into Hebrews chapter 9.
Yeah.
So you read this morning from Hebrews 4.
Yeah.
You kept saying it was 4:15. It was not. We were trying to find it, and we didn't find it before the end of service.
It's all good.
So we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 9.
Yeah.
We're going to start in verse number 11.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and give you all a little behind the scenes. We were going to start in verse 1, but there's some really odd stuff happening in verses 8 through 10.
Yeah, that we need to think about a little bit more.
We don't feel comfortable talking about publicly yet.
Yeah.
Until we've studied a little more on them and figured out what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
So that may be something that comes later. Just because it's something that we were both really interested in when we read it earlier.
Yeah.
And we may need to come back later to touch on that.
Yeah.
But we're going to go ahead and start in verse 11 here.
Yeah.
And here, the writer of the Hebrews says, "But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with the hands, that is, not of this creation." So we see there, Christ is called the high priest.
Right.
So the high priest in the Old Testament sacrificial system, he's the only one allowed to enter
the Holy of Holies.
The Holy of Holies, the most holy place.
Right. Now, Christ is called the high priest, right? And so the tent, too, that he's going to go through it's going to be a different tabernacle or a different tent than the one that the high priest in the Old Testament, than the one that he went through.
Right.
So,
it specifically says it's the greater and more perfect tent that is not of this creation.
Yeah, it is the thing that the copy of the tabernacle and the temple, it is the copy. Those things were copies, and those copies were pointing to this thing that Christ is going to enter into.
Right. So then in verse 12, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves,
Okay, right.
but by means of his own blood.
So Christ doesn't sacrifice animals the way that the old high priest did under the old covenant, or the first covenant that the writer of Hebrews is going to call it. Rather, he offers himself up as a perfect, spotless lamb. He's called the Lamb of God, and he offers himself up, and he's without blemish.
Right. And it goes on to say there, so by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption.
Right.
So just like we talked about, the sacrificial system gave them atonement for a year.
Yeah.
There was a yearly atonement sacrifice that had to be made.
Yeah.
But here,
It's
in
possible to.
verse
That means
12,
it's possible under the old covenant to not be atoned for.
right. Like if you made the atonement and then you miss out on the atonement the next year, you're outside of the covenant.
You're right. That's right.
For a year. You're outside of the promise for a year. But here we see that because his sacrifice was by means of his own blood, it secured an eternal redemption.
Right. So that means that those who are under this covenant and who have this sacrifice made on their behalf by the high priest, their atonement and their redemption is secure and eternal. Securing an eternal redemption is what the writer of Hebrews says in verse 12. And I'll back up here a little bit. And the reason why this is true is because Jesus is the high priest of a better covenant.
Right.
So the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 8 says this. He says, for if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them, then he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I'll establish a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers, when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant. So there we can see that it was possible to fall outside of the covenant, to not be atoned for under the old covenant. He said, so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their hearts. I will be my God. They shall be their people. Shall be my people. They shall no longer teach each other and to his neighbor, saying, know the Lord. For they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest. I will be merciful toward their iniquities. I will remember their sins no more. So, all who are in this new covenant know the Lord. They are atoned for. Right? That's the promise given. I think that's from Jeremiah. Let me see here. We're verse 3. It's from Jeremiah. And so this promise was promising a covenant that would be unlike the old covenant. So that's the reason why Jesus, as the high priest, can offer up a once-for-all sacrifice that secures an eternal redemption. It's a better covenant. And he's the greater high priest.
Yep. So the writer of Hebrews goes on in verse 13, and he says, for if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God?
Okay. Well, that's interesting as well.
Yeah, so we're seeing a definite distinction here between the old sacrificial system and what you could call the new sacrificial system.
Right. Yeah, so if the blood of the bulls and the goats and the sprinkling of a defiled person with the ashes of the heifer, if that can sanctify them and purify them and make them sacred space to enter back into the presence of God for that year, right, then how much more precious and how much better is the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself up without blemish to God, is basically the argument there, right? If those things, which were not as good as this, could do this, how much better and how much more will this blood, how much better this is than that?
Right.
Yeah, so more contrast.
Yep. So then we get into what you were talking about a little bit ago in verse 15.
Yeah.
Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant.
Yep, that's right.
So that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant.
Right.
So we see that there's a death that has occurred, and it has redeemed them from, the way it says it is, redeemed them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant.
Yep.
So basically what we're saying here is that through Christ's death, we've been redeemed from our failures to keep the first covenant.
Right.
This is something that we've talked about. I talked about with the kids in my community group this last week, and then we talked about a little bit in our Sunday school class this morning, that the gospel is bad news before it's good news.
Right. Yep.
You have to see that you have failed to keep the old covenant, and that no one is able to perfectly keep the old covenant. Everyone, even if you somehow manage to not physically commit any of the sins listed in the Old Covenant, your mind will still betray you.
Right.
And that kind of thing. Getting into what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount with that kind of stuff. So we see here that we are now, there's been a death now that has redeemed us from any sin that was committed under the Old Covenant. Then get into verse 16. And this was kind of interesting when we read it earlier. So he kind of shifts language here in verse 16. He's talking about the death, he's talking about the sacrifice, he's talking about covenants. But then 16, he starts talking about a will.
Right.
Before we read it, I want to clarify what type of will he's talking about.
Yeah,
it's the kind of will you write out when you're living to determine
who
gets your stuff when you die.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So that's what he's talking about here in verse 16. He says, "For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive." That seems like it's a little out of left field when you're reading it.
Yeah.
Like that's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
And then he jumps into that. So verse 18 kind of starts to get back into what he's talking about. So verse 18 says, "Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood."
Right.
So he's kind of comparing the covenant to a will. He's comparing covenants to a will.
You can see why, too. Will and testament.
Right.
Testament is another word for covenant. Yep. So will and covenant. So you can see that.
But Jesus here, what I think, we didn't really talk about this one beforehand, but I think what he's getting at a little bit is that basically through Jesus' death, his will is executed.
Right.
And his will is for the purification and the redemption and the atonement of his people.
Right. His will is to secure an eternal redemption, to use the language of the writer in verse 12. Yep. I agree with that. And the what he's referencing to with not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. He's appealing to Exodus 24, right, where Moses is ratifying the covenant, and he takes the blood. It says Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, half the blood, threw it against the altar. So he's throwing blood on temple, tabernacle furniture at this point, making it sacred space, right, because it purifies. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the hearing of all the people, and they said, "All the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses takes the blood, he throws it on the people, purifying them, and says, "Behold, the book of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance to these words." So that's what it's in reference to there.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna take a little kind of a break here before we move on and talk about the interesting choice of words here to call that the first covenant.
Yeah, right.
Because most scholars today would probably, if you ask them what the first covenant is, they would probably go with the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
Which occurred before the Mosaic Covenant, or even the Noahic Covenant.
Right.
So you have those two covenants, the covenant made with Abraham and the covenant made with Noah, that occur before the covenant made with Moses. You could even say that there is the covenant of grace that we talked about when we talked about the curses, that covenant made in Genesis 3:15 that is made with Adam and Eve. You could even say that covenant is before the covenant of Moses that the author of Hebrews multiple times refers to as the first covenant.
Yeah.
So why do you think he refers to that as the first covenant instead of the covenants that came before it?
It's a good question. I don't know. Something I'll have to think about a little bit more. I could see. I know one argument that I have heard, and I don't know if I agree with it. I really need to get into Hebrews and to think about it more. I have seen them classify all of the old covenant covenants, the individual covenants with, say, Adam and Eve, with Noah, Abraham. they classify all of those under Old Covenant and then use that as a generalization to refer to as First Covenant. But it seems to me like that whoever's writing Hebrews is referring to the Mosaic Covenant in particular as the First Covenant. So I know that you had maybe an explanation that you were thinking of.
Yeah,
I got to think about it some more. But
so I have maybe 2 explanations.
Yeah.
Or at least 2 that make sense to me.
Yeah.
So the Mosaic Covenant is the first covenant made from man to God. It's the first one where it's kind of a conditional covenant.
Right.
God says, if you do this, I will do this.
Right.
Yeah,
it's unlike the others.
The covenant of grace is just God saying, I will do this.
Right.
Same thing with the Abrahamic covenant. Same thing with the Noahic covenant.
Right.
I will do this. There's no condition that man has to keep for those covenants. This is the first one where there's condition man has to keep.
Right.
A second thing I was thinking about while you were talking there is that your other first 3 covenants, the covenant of grace, or if you want to call it that, the covenant given to Eve,
Right.
that she would have a seed that would crush the head of the serpent.
Right.
The covenant given to Abraham that from his line there would be a great nation and there would be a savior delivered. And then the covenant given to Noah that he would save Noah from the flood with the ark, and then he would never flood the whole world again.
Right.
Those are covenants not given to a nation.
Yeah.
Those covenants are not given to Israel.
Right.
Those are covenants given to a family or a person.
Yeah.
They're given to the woman, to Abraham, to Noah, where the Mosaic covenant is given to the nation of Israel.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation, honestly. It's the first covenant given to the people of Israel.
Right.
Like the others is made with their descendants and predecessors,
Right.
some of that kind of thing.
And that's who the book of Hebrews is more geared toward in New Testament times.
Right.
It's more geared toward the Christian Israelites.
That's right. Yep.
So this is the first covenant given to them. I think may explain why he refers to it as the first covenant, because they may see it as the first covenant.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it's a fairly good explanation.
So the next few verses here kind of recaps what we read in Exodus, that Moses went in. Moses took the blood of the calves and goats, and he sprinkled the book, sprinkled the people, sprinkled it on all of the things that were used for worship, that kind of thing. But verse 22 is kind of where we're going to get back to Genesis 3:21.
Yeah.
So verse 22, it says, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins."
Yep. So that's what's going on in Genesis 3:21. Right, we have the shedding of blood, which is for the forgiveness of sins.
Right.
Right. So atonement, sacrifice, purification, substitution, all those things we've talked about already in this episode. So, all right.
Okay, so you want to go ahead and
go ahead.
down
Yeah, we'll go ahead and
chapter
go on
9?
Yeah.
Okay, so in verse 23, we see the writer of Hebrews say, "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these."
Right. Yeah. So those the copies, the tabernacle, and the tabernacle and the temple are purified, which are copies, by the blood of animals.
Right.
Right. And so how much better then, since it was necessary that those things, the copies of the heavenly things, be purified, how much better is it that these, it says, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these.
Right. So if the tabernacle and the temple are copies of heavenly things that need to be purified, then what are the heavenly things that need to be purified that those are copies of?
Yeah, that it's. I'm thinking here in some ways. I'm wondering. Here's the image that it's kind of drawn to my mind, and I might be off base with this. It's almost reminding me of, the temple and the tabernacle are copies. They're microcosms, right? So they're you've got outer court. You've got holy place, most holy place, which is representing world, land, garden, that kind of thing. And so the image that it's drawn to my mind is Christ being cut off in profane space, right? He's cut off. So that blood purified that stuff.
Right.
So I'm thinking on my feet here because I've not spent enough time in Hebrews to really know exactly what's going on here in a objective way. But it almost makes me wonder if it's in some reference to that, but it doesn't. I don't know. But it mentions these heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices. So I don't know.
Okay, but, so what I'm kind of seeing here, and again, I could be off base, but
we're gonna have to spend some time in Hebrews.
We are. But what I'm seeing is the temple and the tabernacle. What were they? They were the temporary dwelling space of
God.
The presence of God.
Right.
They were the temporary meeting place between God and man. So what is that permanent meeting space between God and man? It is the redeemed man.
Right. Yeah.
So is the redeemed man the heavenly thing that needs to be purified with a better sacrifice than the bulls and the goats?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to think on it.
If we go on down into verse 24, we see, "For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself,
right,
now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf."
Right. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest. So that's going back to what we talked about earlier.
Right, with it being once and for all.
Every year with the blood not his own for when he had to suffer repeatedly. Yeah. Interesting things going on here that I need to look into more.
Going on down to verse 26 says, "But as it is, he has appeared once for all
at the end of the
ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself."
Right.
And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him.
Yeah, so we got some eschatology added there to that promise at the end. So Christ has already done the work of sacrifice. When he returns, he's coming not to offer up a sacrifice, but to save those who have already experienced the sacrifice, who have already had the sacrifice made on their behalf, which is interesting. Because if we want to get into eschatology, for those who believe kind of in a pre-trib rapture where people's got this time to, Christ kind of makes like a half return, and he raptures people out, and then people have an opportunity to kind of believe, and that seems to kind of almost militate against that in some ways. It's Christ appears a second time, so he's the first time when he first came.
Right.
Then there's the second time he appears,
but he is not appearing that second time to deal with sin.
That's right. He's coming to save those who are eagerly waiting for him.
Right.
Yep.
So he's not dealing with sin. He's not coming a second time to forgive sin.
That's right. He's coming to save those who have already received this sacrifice made on their behalf. So, man, I think that we could spend a whole lot of time in Hebrews chapter 9. There is so much going on here.
Yeah.
But,
so, before we get too lost in Hebrews,
I'm trying not to,
because we could go a lot longer in Hebrews. Let's get to a little bit of application.
Yeah.
So, when we look at the sacrificial system, I know that's weird to look for application in not just the sacrificial system, but to look for application in the fact that God made Adam and Eve clothes.
Right.
Seems a little odd to look for application there.
It seems that way on the surface.
But there's a lot of application that we can see there.
Yeah.
So you want to start us off there with a couple points of application that we can have?
Yeah, there's a few points of application here, and I'll, here's kind of the way that I framed it to our congregation this morning. Let me back up here and touch on one last implication of what Jesus has done.
Okay.
One last implication is because he has offered himself up as this perfect sacrifice, and he has went into the Holy of Holies. The writer of Hebrews also says, and I found it's 15. Hebrews 4:15, not 16.
Well, 4:15 was the one you kept saying.
Sorry,
it was wrong.
It's 4:16.
Okay.
It's 4:16. It's the next verse. So he says this, that he talks about prior to that, that Jesus is the great high priest who has offered up this once for all sacrifice. And he says, therefore, let us draw with confidence near to the throne of grace, that we might receive mercy and find grace and help in the time of need. So basically what he's saying is, you have been made sacred space again. You've been sprinkled with the blood of Christ, right? It covers you. It's an atonement. Now you can come back into the presence of God, right? So now you can come into the Holy of Holies, right? You can come to the throne now. That's shocking in some ways. Right? That's mind blowing in some ways. So here's kind of how I
and that written to the Christian Israelites.
That
would be even more shocking than it is to us.
Oh, yeah. That would be scandalous in some ways.
We've not grown up as a people who, okay, let's have one person elected that's allowed to go into that place one time a year, and hopefully he's good enough and he doesn't die when he walks in.
Right.
We've not grown up with that. We're not accustomed to that.
That's not our context.
But that's what Israel lived in. That's what happened with them.
Yeah.
So when the writer of Hebrews is saying this to Israel,
yeah,
how shocking is it that, okay, we have a new high priest that has gone in, and because of that new high priest, we are all able to go in.
Yeah. And it ties into the whole doctrine of union with Christ. We are united to him by faith. And so, therefore, where he is, we are as well. And that's why, Paul says in Ephesians 2 that we have been seated with Christ in the heavenly places, right? We can now draw near to the throne of grace. So the way that I kind of framed this morning was in this way. So, okay. So you've got two options here, right? Which is you receive the covering that God offers through the garments of skin offered up in his son Jesus Christ, who offered his flesh up to be broken, right?
Right.
Or you be like Adam and Eve, who try to cover themselves with garments that they try to fashion themselves.
Right.
Which you've hit on this before. Adam and Eve very well could be the first legalist who try to cover over their own sins. And very often, that's what we try to do, right? We try to cover over our own sins rather than going to God and letting him cover over us with Christ's righteousness. So those are the two options you've got, right? Receive the covering God offers, or try to cover yourself, right? And so that's one way that I would say it. So there might be some more application here that you want to tease out.
Yeah. So we can look at it that way. You can either accept the covering that God has created, that God has given, that God has formed for you,
right?
Or you can form your own covering. And when you form your own covering, it's going to look like things. Well, okay. I guess the best way to say it is when you receive the covering from God, you receive acceptance.
Yeah.
You receive mercy.
Yeah.
You receive grace, and you receive atonement. But if you get out into the world, and you try to form a covering for yourself that will get you acceptance and atonement and mercy and grace, you're going to keep struggling to find that. Yeah. If you look at the things that are going on in the world with people who are kind of pushing those things themselves, you see that group of people, and you'll see it both in the left-leaning and right-leaning people. You see that those people that get farther away from the covering of Christ, they kind of start eating themselves.
Yeah.
You're never able to fashion a covering that will get you full atonement.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's always more to atone for.
Yeah.
You're never able to get full acceptance because there's always more things that you'll be rejected for.
Yeah. That's good. And you'll try to look to your own works to try to please God. And God, the Bible teaches, Paul specifically says this in Romans, that apart from Christ, our works are as filthy rags.
Right.
So that's not going to work. You can't fashion your own covering and fool God.
Right.
Right. Yeah, you might fool people, but you won't fool God. Now, another thing, too, here that the author of Hebrews writes, he says, let us draw near to the throne of grace. So we've got access again. But he says that we might receive mercy and grace and help in our time of need.
Right.
Now, the way that I said it this morning to our congregation is I said it this way. There are some of you here and some of you who are listening this evening or who may listen later who are trying to look to things in the world that you're trying to look to these things in the world to try to find mercy, grace, and help in your time of need when only the things in heaven are actually going to be able to provide that for you, right? Some people listening and who may listen, they're looking for mercy in the world. They're looking for grace in the world. They're looking for help in their time of need. And those are good things to seek after, right? Atonement is something good to seek after. Mercy, grace, help, those are good things. The problem is that we look to all the wrong places for those things, right? We look to people, right? We look to our spouses, our friends, our children even.
When you look to temporary beings for mercy and grace and atonement, you receive temporary mercy, grace, and atonement.
Right. That's absolutely right. And then we look to people. We look to places like vacation spots. Right. A lot of people. I got to get away for a while, and I got to rest and recharge and get. Nothing wrong with vacations. Great things. I'm going to go on a vacation myself this year. But whenever we look to those things for things they were never designed for, we're turning them into idols.
Right.
And then we also look to things, right? Our work, our home, our money, our cars, whatever it may be. Those things cannot give us atonement, cannot give us mercy, cannot give us grace or help in time of need. And I think that what happens to us whenever we do this is we experience what Augustine felt before he was a Christian and while he's a Christian. He says that our hearts are restless until they finally find their rest in God.
Right.
Right. And that's what we'll experience if we try to find these things in those. So the only options that we have is to go into the arms of this loving God, which are outstretched towards us, who is wanting to cover us and take away the coverings we have fashioned.
Yep. I think that's really good, and that about covers the application that we have out of this.
No pun intended.
Right. So that about covers what we have for application here. That we can, we have the covering offered to us. We have the offer of this atonement, this covering, these clothes that will hide our spiritual nakedness.
Yeah.
And those have been given to us through Christ.
Yeah, it's all there in Christ. And I'm telling you, that quote by St. Augustine, it comes from his book Confessions. Just really great book. That has always stuck in my mind when I said that. And that has become the center of my thought on a lot of these things, that whenever we look to things other than God, it leads to restlessness in our hearts. And what God is offering us today through our great high priest and the once-for-all sacrifice that he has offered on our behalf is real rest.
Yeah.
Rest from the year in, year out sacrifices. Rest from trying to cover ourselves and to atone for ourselves. And rest from trying to find mercy, help, and grace in people, places, and things. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and throw my pen down.
Yep.
I'm done.
I think that's really good. So next week, we're going to wrap up Genesis chapter 3. We're going to talk about Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden.
Yep.
Some interesting things happening there when they're being expelled from the garden. Be some interesting stuff to look at with the way that they're expelled, the guardians that are put in place to keep them from returning to the garden.
Right.
And then what that means for humanity that we were expelled from the garden. So it's going to be some fun stuff to look at next week. So if you have any questions about that, if you have any questions about anything we've touched on today, anything in the book of Genesis so far that we've touched on, feel free to get those questions to us. You can post them here on the video on either Facebook or YouTube. You can send us a message through Facebook Messenger, or you can send us an email. Go to our website, newhavenwv.com, click the Resources tab at the top of the page, and then click Talks at New Haven. And there'll be a form there. You can send us an email, and we will get to those.
Sounds good.
All right, so I don't have anything else today. If you are finished,
I'm finished.
Then we will see you guys next week.
See you then.